January 30th, 1945. Around 9:30 in the evening, 20 miles off the Pomeranian coast, an officer on the bridge of a passenger liner carrying more than 10,000 people gives a short order. Switch on the navigation lights. Within a minute, a red light burns to port, a green light to starboard, and 208 meters of steel hull stand out in the darkness, in the middle of a winter sea where Soviet submarines are working. The ship that spent the whole evening hidden in blackout and snow has just made itself visible. Within 40 minutes, this liner will go under, taking with it around 9,000 people, roughly 5,000 of them children. More will die here than on the Titanic, the Lusitania, and the Empress of Ireland combined. This is the greatest loss of life on a single ship in all of history. And here is the first thing worth knowing about this night. The order that killed them did not come from the enemy. It came from their own bridge. A few cable lengths below the surface, the commander of the Soviet submarine S-13, Alexander Marinesco, looks through his periscope and cannot believe his luck. For 3 weeks he has searched for any target at all, a court-martial waiting behind him, and now, lit up, at slow speed, a large gray ship with anti-aircraft guns on her deck is passing in front of him. By every rule he was taught, this is a legitimate military target. And technically he is right. This armed transport under a naval flag really is carrying almost 1,000 submariners. Alongside them, she is carrying those same 5,000 children. From here, the whole story breaks down into a chain of decisions, each of which, on its own, seemed reasonable. Overload the ship 5 times beyond capacity. Send her out under 4 captains who could not agree. Keep a single escort, and then none at all. And at the end, switch on the lights above her. We will take these decisions one at a time. And one more thing, which we will return to at the very end. The man at this periscope will become the most successful submarine commander his country ever produced. And then that same country will send him to a labor camp and erase his name for almost half a century. What it does to him will turn out to be as cold as the water he is staring into now. To understand why one hull ended up carrying so many people, we have to go back 8 years, to a launch attended by Hitler himself. On the 5th of May 1937, at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, a liner slid down the slipway. 208.5 meters long, 23 meters wide, 25,484 gross register tons. 4 8-cylinder MAN diesels gave her a speed of about 15 knots. She was not built for war. She was built for leisure. She was the first ship built specifically for the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, Kraft durch Freude, a branch of the German labor front under Robert Ley. The idea was simple and convenient for the regime. An ordinary German worker who could never in his life have afforded an ocean cruise was given a subsidized ticket on a real ocean liner. She had a sister ship, the Robert Ley, but it was the Gustloff that became the flagship of this holiday fleet, a showcase meant to present a more acceptable face of the Third Reich to the world. There is a story behind the ship's name that makes everything that follows colder. She was meant to be called Adolf Hitler. The name was changed because of a murder. On the 4th of February 1936 in Davos, Switzerland, a medical student named David Frankfurter, a Yugoslav Jew driven to despair by the rise of Nazism, shot Wilhelm Gustloff, head of the Swiss branch of the Nazi Party. The regime turned the dead functionary into a martyr at once. Hitler sat beside his widow at the memorial service and, on that wave, decided the new liner would carry Gustloff's name. So a propaganda cruise ship took the name of a man killed for Nazism, and it would carry that name all the way to the bottom, together with 9,000 refugees fleeing that very regime. The cabins were arranged with a purpose, almost all identical, without class divisions, to create the image of a ship without ranks, a society of equals under the swastika. You could not simply book a passage. Passengers were chosen by the party, and whoever was chosen received a cabin, a concert, a swimming pool, a promenade deck, and around the clock the propaganda that was the whole point. Over 17 months of peacetime service, the Gustloff made around 50 cruises and carried some 65,000 holidaymakers. She took Germans and Austrians to the coasts of Norway and Madeira. In April of 38, she lay at anchor in international waters off the English port of Tilbury and served as a floating polling station so that Germans and Austrians living in Britain could vote for the annexation of Austria, and out of almost 2,000 votes, only 10 were cast against union with Germany. In the spring of 39, she helped bring the Condor Legion home from Spain after Franco's victory. Each of these roles was about one thing: to show the strength of the regime and its care for its own. The point of all that peacetime service was a single one. The regime promised its people care. Serve us, and you will receive what you never had: a holiday, a cabin, the sea. 7 years later, that same regime would pack those cabins and lounges 10 times over and send them into a winter sea under torpedoes, and the promise would turn into its opposite. The ship that had been a showcase of the state's care for the individual would become the place where that state destroyed the individual more surely than any enemy. Then the peace ended, and they began doing to the ship what is done to any large object in war. They repainted her for whatever role the Navy needed at that moment. From the autumn of 39, she became a hospital ship, a white hull with a green stripe, officially designated Hospital Ship D. And on her very first voyage, she took aboard wounded Polish soldiers of the country Germany had just crushed. A year later, the medical equipment was removed, and the green stripe was painted over in standard naval gray. And from November of 1940, the liner, built to move and to be seen, came to a pier and stopped moving altogether. For more than 4 years, she sat in the Polish port of Gdynia, which the Germans had seized and renamed Gotenhafen. All that time, she served as a floating barracks for around 1,000 cadets of the 2nd Submarine Training Division. Young men being prepared as crews for Donitz's new boats were housed in cabins where workers had once taken their holidays, and that proximity would come back to matter. Over those 4 years at the wall, part of what would one day save or fail to save people quietly disappeared from the ship. The lifeboats. They were taken and lent out for the needs of the port, for minor work around the harbor, and by 1945, the full complement was no longer aboard. On paper, the liner was still rated as a life-saving vessel for over 1,000 people. In practice, there were far fewer boats, some of them frozen into their davits, and the number of people to be evacuated no longer had anything to do with those figures. And before her last voyage, anti-aircraft guns were mounted on her decks. The decision made sense. Soviet aircraft hung in the sky, and the ship was given at least some means to defend herself. But that decision had a second, invisible consequence, which we will return to at the end. The moment the guns appeared on deck, the Gustloff stopped being a hospital ship in the eyes of the law and became an armed military transport, a legitimate target. The men mounting those barrels were saving the ship from aircraft and, without knowing it, stripping away her last legal protection. Because here is the key number of this ship. She was designed for about 1,900 people, of whom around 400 were crew. 1,900. On her final voyage, she would take on more than 10,000. And every extra body on those decks would be there by the decision of people who knew exactly what they were doing. To understand where those 10,000 came from, you have to look at what was happening behind the ship, on land. By January of 45, East Prussia had become a trap. On the 13th of January, the Red Army launched the East Prussian offensive, and the German defense collapsed. The province's Nazi authorities, led by Gauleiter Erich Koch, delayed the evacuation to the last, afraid that a civilian flight would break morale, and announced it only on the 20th of January, when any orderly departure was already too late. On the 23rd of January, Soviet units reached the sea near Elbing and cut the land route west. Hundreds of thousands of people were left with one way out, across the ice to the sea. The road to safety ran across the frozen Vistula Lagoon. People moved over the ice in columns, with carts, with the old and the children, under snow and Soviet ground attack planes. The ice cracked and gave way, and carts went under with their horses and families. Even the prize horses of the famous Trakehnen stud were driven in that column, and many of them stayed there. Those who reached the ports of Danzig and Gotenhafen were met by a new queue instead of safety. By the 8th of April, in Pilau alone, as many as 450,000 refugees would gather. It was not only the advancing army that drove people to the sea, but fear. Accounts, both true and inflated by propaganda, of what Soviet troops were doing to German civilians in the occupied lands ran through the province, and that fear turned an organized evacuation into an uncontrolled flight. Nazi propaganda had fed the population terror of the East for years, and now that terror was driving mothers and children onto the ice. And even in rescue, the system stayed true to itself. Priority in the evacuation went to the military, while the old, the small children, and the sick were fed last, so that mortality among the weakest was the highest even before any torpedo. Fuel was short. Sea transport was allotted about 3 weeks of coal, the railways less. The order in which people were loaded onto ships, and in which the last food was divided, decided in advance who would make it and who would not, and it did not decide in favor of the weaker. The frost on the pier was so hard the air burned the lungs. Mothers carried sleeping children wrapped in blankets that were stiff with rime by morning. Air raids hung over the harbor every day. The city's power and water had failed. And into this crush, the Gustloff was brought alongside. At first, there was a system at the gangway. People were led on by tickets and boarding passes, priority to women with children, armed sentries at the ramps. The system did not last long. There were too many people and too little time. Some came aboard on forged papers, some for a bribe, some in the crush. A cabin for 2 held 10. In the corridors and storerooms, people lay shoulder to shoulder. The old dining hall, the cinema, any empty space filled with those who sat straight down on the floor. The count was kept while there was paper for it. The ship's purser, Heinz Schön, 19 years old at the time, remembered afterward that after the first 8,000 they stopped registering people because there was nothing left to write with and no time. The official list counted 6,050. The real number, which Schön reconstructed over almost 40 years after the war, came to 10,582. The difference between those figures is everyone led aboard beyond any record. Among the passengers was a group whose fate is worth following separately, because within a few hours something would happen to it that happened to almost no one else. 373 young women of the Navy's Female Auxiliary Service, helpers mostly between 17 and 25 years old. They had been sent by sea precisely because the roads and the railways were considered more dangerous. One of them, Waltraud, came aboard on her 21st birthday, together with a friend and more than 300 of her comrades. They were housed in one of the deepest places on the ship. On E-deck there was a swimming pool, the very one where workers had once come up to relax, with a tiled mosaic of Neptune riding the waves. The water had long been drained, and into that dry concrete basin, lined with tile, all 373 young women were placed, right at the hull, without portholes, from where reaching the open deck meant going through the whole ship and up the ladders. Of those 373, only 3 would live through the night. Why this compartment would become one of the most terrible places on the ship will be clear in a few hours. There was another story here, of the kind that shows how thin chance was. One of the helpers, learning that her colleagues could not finish destroying secret papers before the Russians came, chose to stay and help, set aside her 2 boarding passes, and went back to the pier, to the work. The 2 tickets to the Gustloff that she gave up willingly saved her life. She stayed on shore and survived, and the ship sailed without her. Inside it was cold and stuffy at once. The boilers were working, but the heat vanished the moment it left the pipes. Rime settled on the bulkheads, the handrails, the metal of the deck. In the sick bay lay soldiers wounded at the front. Somewhere on board, a section had been set up for pregnant women, because there were such women among the refugees, and they had been given a makeshift maternity ward in the middle of an evacuation. Around 9 in the evening, the loudspeakers would carry yet another radio address by Hitler, marking the 12th anniversary of his coming to power, and almost no one packed into those halls would be listening. From the crowding and the boilers below, it grew unseasonably hot, and here a trap lay waiting that no one thought about. People had been ordered not to take off their life jackets, but in the closeness, many took them off and set them aside because it was impossible to breathe in them. In a few hours, when they would have to jump into freezing water, some of those jackets would be left lying in the crowded cabins, and some would be put on wrong. Maritime safety on this ship lost to ordinary human exhaustion from the heat before the first explosion. Up top, it was the reverse. The decks had iced over, and sailors scattered sand so people would not fall as they pushed through the dense mass of bodies. The wind cut the face. The handrails burned bare fingers with cold. Every breath caught in the chest. Between that icy deck and the stifling halls below lived those 10,000 and more people, while the ship carried them into the dark. And here it is worth stopping on the word that changes everything. Safer. Everyone on this ship believed that getting aboard the Gustloff meant being half saved. A ticket to her was called exactly that, half of salvation, and one survivor remembered that, to them, she was a Noah's Ark. A big, solid, respectable-looking ship seemed more reliable than the ice roads and the overloaded fishing boats. But the most dangerous thing on this ship that night waited for people up top, on the bridge. There, in that very minute, an argument was underway on which the fate of everyone packed into the cabins, the halls, and the pool below depended. And not one of those arguing yet understood that the decision had already all but been made for them. On the bridge of the Gustloff that night, 4 men were in command, and not one of them held full authority over the ship. This came from the dual nature of the voyage. The liner was sailing under Operation Hannibal and, at the same time, both as a civilian vessel and as a military transport, which meant she answered to 2 chains of command at once, meeting on one bridge and unwilling to yield to each other. The civilian master was Friedrich Petersen, 63 years old, an old merchant seaman responsible for the navigation. Beside him stood Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn, 33, commander of the 2nd Submarine Training Division, under whom stood most of the military aboard. Their authority overlapped awkwardly. Petersen commanded the ship. Zahn commanded most of the people on that ship. 2 others completed the 4. Captain Weller, the navigator and officer of the watch, and Lieutenant Commander Paul Vollrath, who oversaw the female auxiliary service. None of them had the final word, and each added his voice to an argument in which too many people were steering one ship. The argument began almost as soon as they cleared port, and its subject was exactly one thing: how not to be hit by a torpedo. Zahn, a submariner who knew how his own students hunted, urged running along the coast in full blackout, without a single light, at slow speed over the shallows, where a submarine finds it hard to make an attack. Petersen objected that the coastal waters were packed with German minefields, and that their own mine would kill them sooner than an enemy submarine. Zahn answered that the channel had already been swept, and demanded raising speed to 15 knots simply to outrun any threat. Petersen objected again. The engines, 4 years idle at the wall, would not take that strain, and he held to 12 knots. Neither man gave way. In the end, they settled on a compromise that satisfied no one. Zigzagging along swept channel number 58, about 20 miles off the Pomeranian coast. It was meant to combine stealth and speed. In practice, it combined the weaknesses of both choices. Deep water, where a submarine works comfortably, and slow speed, which cannot outrun anything. And as the snow thickened and holding a shifting course grew harder, the zigzag was abandoned altogether, and they settled onto a straight line, because it was simpler to keep to the channel that way. And then the escort began to fall away from the ship. The Gustloff had not left port alone. She was accompanied by another liner full of refugees, the Hansa, and 2 torpedo boats. Fairly soon, the Hansa and one of the torpedo boats developed mechanical failures and had to stop. One escort remained, the torpedo boat Löwe. Then, in the thickening snow, The Louvre went ahead, perhaps to scout the way, and was lost in the snow. Contact broke, and for the rest of the night the liner, with 10,000 people aboard, sailed the open sea entirely alone, without a single ship beside her able to hunt a submarine. And it was then that the decision was made that stands above all the others. Over the ship's radio came a report of an oncoming formation of minesweepers ahead, and of mines in these waters. The warning would later prove to be mistaken. Fearing a collision in the dark, the bridge broke the blackout and switched on the navigation lights to make out the water ahead. Red to port, green to starboard. 208 meters of steel hull lit up in the snow, in the middle of a sea where Soviet submarines were working. The ship that had hidden all evening in blackout and snow made itself visible, and the sea beneath her was exactly what Zahn had feared. In the winter of '45, the waters off the Gila Peninsula and the Stolpa Bank had become a hunting ground for Soviet submarines, watching the evacuation convoys. German anti-submarine defense was stretched to the limit. Too many crowded, slow ships and too few escorts. The S-13 herself, 2 weeks before this night, had already been attacked several times by German patrol boats and had slipped away. To send an essentially unarmed liner at slow speed through these waters, with one torpedo boat for escort, was to lead her into a place where the enemy had every chance, even without any lights. The lights simply turned the chance into something close to a certainty. We promised to return to whether the man at the periscope was right. Here it is worth saying something else. One ship in that war would take more people to the bottom than any vessel before or since. And almost every one of the decisions that led to it was made on their own side. The fivefold overload, the divided command, the abandoned escort, slow speed over deep water, the cancelled zigzag, and the switched-on lights. For 4 years at the wall, this liner had sheltered around 1,000 future submariners. And that night, the same Navy sent its own people straight toward just such a submarine, running at full speed, in the light, without escort. If you find it worth understanding how a single technical decision on a bridge turns into thousands of fates below, subscribing helps the channel keep making these breakdowns, and means you won't miss the next one. Now, let us go back below the water, to the man for whom those switched-on lights were a gift. Alexander Marinesco that night was a commander with nothing to lose. 32 years old, the son of a Romanian sailor and a Ukrainian woman from Odessa. He had seen in the new year ashore in the Finnish town of Hanko with a Swedish restaurant owner, then vanished for several days, and a charge of desertion hung over him, along with a forbidden liaison with a foreigner. The commander of the Baltic fleet chose not to court-martial him at once, because the boat would then be left without a captain for a long time, and instead sent him to sea to prove what he was worth. For 3 weeks he found nothing. And now, in the crosshairs of his periscope, stood a large ship moving at slow speed, steady, with lights. For a commander with a court-martial waiting behind him, 10,000 refugees simply did not exist in that moment. In the optics stood his career, which one salvo could save. He saw a gray military hull, anti-aircraft barrels, wartime lights where there should have been none, and by every rule he had been taught, this was a legitimate target, full of soldiers. He surfaced and for almost 2 hours ran a parallel course, coming in from the shoreward side, where he was least expected, because no threat was thought possible from there. Around 9 in the evening he made his attack. Of the 4 torpedoes, 3 were chalked with words, "For the motherland, for the Soviet people, for Leningrad." The 4th jammed in its tube and had to be disarmed inside the boat, while 3 were already running toward the target. The 1st struck the bow, where the off-duty crew were sleeping in their quarters. The impact triggered the watertight doors, which slammed shut before the sleeping men could get out. The people who were supposed to help lower the lifeboats were trapped in the first seconds. The 2nd torpedo hit the area of the drained swimming pool on E-deck, that same compartment at the hull from which reaching the deck meant crossing the whole ship. 373 young women of the auxiliary service were sleeping there. The blast tore through the changing rooms and shattered the tiled mosaic, turning the tile into a stream of fragments, flying at enormous speed through an enclosed space with no way out. Of the 373 helpers, only 3 survived. Waltraud Grüte, who had marked her 21st birthday here, was one of those for whom this pool became the last place. The third torpedo went into the engine room and killed the power. The light went out through the whole hull at once. The engine stopped. The radio fell silent. Thousands of people below found themselves in total darkness on decks that were already tilting, and the ladders they had climbed aboard an hour before now ran up, then sideways. The way up was there, but in that darkness they could no longer find it. After that, the laws that no one on the bridge had repealed began to work. The ship heeled to port, toward where the water pulled her. The portside boats went out of reach. There was no getting to them now. The starboard boats were frozen to their davits, and sailors hacked at the ice with knives and axes in the wind and the snow. Only a few could be lowered, and when the list grew sharp, the boats hanging high on the starboard side struck the tilting hull as they came down and spilled their people into the water. What people did in these minutes is known from the survivors, and it matters more than any description of the explosion. A 10-year-old boy named Horst Voigt saw people trampled to death on the ladders, and many of them were children. An elderly woman pushed a teenage girl into an alcove, gave her her own fur coat, and jumped overboard herself. A burly sailor shoved grown men aside to get one auxiliary girl into a boat. Some fathers with pistols chose to kill their own quickly rather than let them die slowly in the icy water. One Nazi official shot his wife by agreement and could not bring himself to do the same to himself, and a soldier standing nearby finished him with his own weapon. And all around was water at about 4 degrees in an air frost of -10 to -18. In such water, a person loses consciousness within minutes, and very few lasted longer than 10. One survivor remembered afterward the hands that clutched at the side of her boat, and the people still clinging to the railings as the ship went under. In less than an hour, it was over. Paul Vollrath, one of those 4 officers from the bridge who survived, wrote afterward that in that short time, the ship had dragged the love, the hope, and the wishes of so many people down to the bottom. The Gustloff went down bow first, to a depth of about 44 meters. Ships passing nearby came to the place of her sinking, and here the rescuers began their own unbearable arithmetic. The torpedo boat T-36, under Robert Herring, pulled people from the water until she was full, and then had to zigzag away from that same submarine so as not to share the liner's fate. One of the escort ships dropped depth charges, trying to reach the submarine, and those blasts almost certainly killed some of those still holding on in the water nearby. To rescue and to defend at the same time was impossible, and each commander on the spot chose whom to lift out and whom to pass by. By dawn, the surface of the sea was covered with bodies, and in them the whole injustice of that night could be read. Children who had put on adult life jackets were held head down by the water. The last living find was made when one of the boats seemed dead. Among the frozen bodies lay a tightly wrapped infant, the only one still breathing. The officer who found him took the child as his own and raised him afterward. Of everyone in that boat, he alone lived on past the war. The rescued were taken to the ports of Sassnitz, Kiel, and back to Gotenhafen. At Sassnitz, a Danish hospital ship met them. Many came ashore with frostbitten hands and feet. Some were carried out on stretchers. And there was one more detail that says more about the character of this catastrophe than any figure. All 4 captains from the bridge, the very men who had argued over speed, course, and lights, were saved. The people who made the decisions survived, almost to a man. 370 of the 373 young women from the pool did not. What could be done that night is best measured in people. The torpedo boat T-36 lifted 564 people. The torpedo boat Löwe, the one that had been lost in the snow, came back and lifted 472. The minesweepers added around 180, the steamer Göttingen 28, a torpedo recovery boat 7, another vessel 2, and a patrol boat pulled a single infant from the water. In all, 1,252 people were saved, and 13 of them died later. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, herself with 1,500 refugees aboard, passed nearby and did not stop, because somewhere close by there was still a submarine. The next morning the water was full of bodies, and many of the children were held afloat head down by their life jackets, because the jacket was sized for an adult. For weeks after that night, the frozen bodies were washed onto the Baltic shores. By the research of Heinz Schön, around 9,343 people died, roughly 5,000 of them children. The exact number will never be known, and estimates run from about 9,000 to 9,600. Even the lowest figure makes this the greatest loss of life on a single ship in history. And now the thing that turns the whole picture over. That night was only one episode of Operation Hannibal. Over 15 weeks, from late January to early May of 45, Donitz gathered everything that would float, from liners to fishing boats, and carried out by sea, by various estimates, between 800,000 and 900,000 civilians, and around 350,000 troops, and by some counts, up to 2 million people. It was the largest sea evacuation in history, larger than the British one at Dunkirk. And against that background, the dead of the Gustloff came to about 1% of everyone who was carried out. The comparison with Dunkirk is worth taking to the end, because it lays the thing bare. At Dunkirk in 1940, the British carried off around 338,000 people in 9 days, and the Royal Air Force held the sky above them, flying thousands of covering sorties. Hannibal carried out several times as many people over 15 weeks, almost without any air cover at all, through waters packed with mines and submarines. The Germans called it their Little Dunkirk, though by numbers it was far larger. It was precisely the scale of that success that made the separate catastrophes convenient to keep quiet about. Donitz himself, in memoirs published a decade and a half later, put the losses of Hannibal at about 1% of those carried out, and entered the operation to his credit as the last great deed of the German Navy. As a matter of statistics, he was right. From the point of view of those 9,000 who lie on the bottom off Pomerania, that 1% was their entire lives. The Gustloff was not the only such night. 11 days later, the same boat, the S-13, sank another overcrowded transport, the General von Steuben, and around 4,500 people went down with her, most of them wounded. In April of 45, another Soviet submarine sank the vessel Goya, and there, out of 7,000, fewer than 200 survived. Thousands more died when British aircraft sank the Cap Arcona, with concentration camp prisoners aboard. The Baltic that winter and spring became a sea where evacuation and death ran side by side, episode after episode, and the Gustloff was only the largest of them. Even those who made it across were not met on the western shore by rescue in the full sense of the word. The receiving ports were not ready for hundreds of thousands of people. The camps and towns of Mecklenburg choked on the influx. There was almost nothing to feed and house the evacuees with, and many, having survived the ice and the sea, fell into fresh want. The system that carried its people out remained, to the end, unable to take them in. There was also an attempt to work out who was to blame for the loss of the Gustloff. A few days later, a Navy board opened an inquiry, but against only one man, Lieutenant Commander Zahn. The measure of his responsibility was never established, because within a few weeks Germany itself collapsed, and there was no one left to answer to, and no one to ask. Not one of those who had argued on the bridge that night and lived bore any punishment for the decisions. Here, too, lies the legal turn we warned about in the first part. Whether this was a lawful act of war or a war crime depends on the status of the ship. And the status was unambiguous. The Gustloff carried anti-aircraft guns, was not marked as a hospital ship, sailed under a naval flag, and was carrying military personnel, including almost 1,000 submariners. A German Institute of Maritime Law later concluded that she was a legitimate military target. Marinesco, looking through his periscope, broke not a single rule of war. The rules were broken by those who put thousands of children aboard an armed military transport. And here is the real shock of this story. The greatest maritime catastrophe in the world turned out to be the most forgotten, and both sides forgot it at once. The Germans stayed silent because behind the sinking lay a chain of their own official mistakes, and no one was in a hurry to raise the suffering of German civilians after what Germany had done in the East. The Soviet side stayed silent because in the sinking of a ship where almost all the dead were refugees and children, there was no victory to hang on a banner. Even Donitz, who organized the whole evacuation, went down in history first of all as a defendant at Nuremberg. The catastrophe did not shorten the war by a single day, and that is exactly why it was more convenient for everyone not to remember it. The West stayed silent too, for its own reasons. The sinking happened in the chaos of the war's last months, under wartime censorship, and the victims were Germans, a population toward which the victors felt not the slightest sympathy. Soon the Cold War began, and to examine how a Soviet submarine had drowned 9,000 German refugees was awkward now on political grounds as well. So a rare situation took shape, in which the greatest maritime catastrophe in history was passed over in silence by three at once. The losers out of shame, the victors for lack of glory, and the rest of the world because pitying these victims seemed out of place. There remains the man at the periscope, and what his own side did to him. Alexander Merinesco was born in Odessa in 1913 to a Romanian sailor who had fled to Russia and a Ukrainian woman. He left school early, moved through the port crowd, sailed as a cabin boy on merchant ships, and then came to a naval school and to the submarine fleet. By the start of the war, he commanded the small boat M96 in the Baltic. Even then, courage and willfulness lived side by side in him, which made him both the best man and the most dangerous to himself in the fleet. Once he brought his boat into base without warning, and his own patrol boats nearly sank her, taking her for an enemy. In 1942, his boat landed a scouting party in Narva Bay with the task of seizing a German cipher machine. And although the machine was not taken and half the party came back, the mission was credited, and Marinesco received the Order of Lenin. Even before the war, he had twice been refused candidacy for the party over drinking and indiscipline, and those entries in his file followed him through his whole service. In a country where an officer's career depended on ideological spotlessness, the most successful submariner was a man with a standing mark of unreliability. Gifted at sea and impossible ashore, he proved to his superiors again and again that, as a commander, he was the best, and again gave those same superiors reason not to forgive him. That combination would decide everything that happened to him after the Gustloff. For that patrol of January 1945, Alexander Marinesco became the most successful Soviet submarine commander by tonnage sunk. In all, about 42,000 gross registered tons stood to his name, more than any other submariner in the Baltic. The background is worth remembering. In those years, more than half of the Soviet boats in the Baltic were lost, and the S-13 was the only surviving boat of her series. By every measure of his own fleet, this was the summit. The hero of the Soviet Union star was not given to him. The command considered him an inconvenient man and, as was said, unsuitable to be a hero. The drinking, the unauthorized absences, that New Year's affair in Hanko. His superiors, moreover, at first did not believe the scale of what he had sunk. Instead of the highest award, he was given the Order of the Red Banner, a lesser decoration. The story goes that when officers came to present that order right on the boat, the insulted Marinesco ordered her to dive. On his next patrol, he made not a single attack, and the patrol was judged unsatisfactory. After that came the fall. In September of 1945, he was demoted to senior lieutenant, and in November discharged from the Navy. He took work ashore, and soon received a sentence for theft, and ended up in a camp on the Kolyma, where he lost his health. The most successful submariner in the country, who had sunk more tonnage than anyone in his fleet, found himself behind barbed wire in the very country for which he had chalked "For the Motherland" on his torpedoes. Only in 1960, after petitions from admirals and veterans, was his rank of Captain Third Class returned to him, along with a small pension. In '63, his friends from the Baltic Fleet arranged for him the ceremonial welcome due to a commander returning from a patrol, the one he had not received in '45. 3 weeks after that, he died of cancer in Leningrad at 50 and was buried in the Bogoslovskoye Cemetery. The title of Hero of the Soviet Union was conferred on him on the 5th of May 1990, posthumously, 27 years after his death and 45 years after that shot. He was honored by a different country now, a few months before it, too, ceased to exist. By that time, the German writer Günter Grass was already preparing a novel about the loss of the Gustloff. Both stories, the ship's and her commander's, were brought back from oblivion by literature, while both states long preferred to stay silent. After '90, the memory of him finally took shape. Monuments were raised to him in Kaliningrad, Kronstadt, and his native Odessa. The submarine museum in Leningrad, become St. Petersburg again, was named after him, and one of the streets was renamed Marinesko Street. That same patrol, for which he was denied the star in life, came in later books to be called the Attack of the Century. The man his own fleet had erased as a disgrace became, half a century on, a hero in the textbooks of a country that no longer existed. This was done mostly by private people. Günter Grass's novel about the Gustloff, published at the start of the 2000s, and a German film made later, brought the catastrophe back into conversation after almost 60 years of silence. Veterans, writers, divers, and one surviving purser did more for the memory of the 9,000 dead and of their killer than either of the two states, which would have preferred to forget. The ship herself lies where she went down, at a depth of about 44 meters off the Pomeranian coast, broken into pieces. The Soviet authorities marked her on their charts simply as an underwater obstacle. The few divers who went down there spoke of piles of bones on the floors of the compartments and of fishing nets snagged on the hull. Heinz Schön, the same purser who lived through that night at 19 and gave 40 years to restoring the names and the numbers, asked that his ashes be scattered over this place, and his wish was carried out. A strange symmetry comes out of it. One system overloaded its ship fivefold, switched on the lights above her, and called it rescue. The other system erased the man who sank that ship, sent him to a camp, and called it discipline. Both the ship and her commander came to rest on the bottom by the decision of their own side. 9,000 people lie in 44 meters of Baltic water off the Pomeranian coast, and most of them never learned that the decision that killed them was made on their own bridge. If this breakdown mattered to you, leave a like and subscribe. That is how these stories reach more people.